Chapter 28. Sainte-Régine, France, May 5, 2020. If the portier hadn't opened the heavy brass door of Au Toit Rouge, Trevor might have blasted right through them. That was how fast he was moving in an effort to put as much distance as possible between himself and his father and great-grandfather. Once clear of the building, he kept on sprinting, heedless of direction. A left turn at the cafe on the corner, a right turn at the bookstore, straight on past the old stone cathedral. The only destination that mattered was away. Where could you go when everything you'd ever believed in was turned upside down? Certainly nowhere in Sainte-Régine, the place where it had all happened. A baby stroller was thrust in front of Trevor. He nearly dislocated every joint in his body in an effort to stop before he flattened it. A young mother scolded him in angry French, and he apologized in halting English, sidestepping and moving off quickly. Jacob Firestone. Not a hero. Worse, practically a villain. A hero wannabe whose carelessness wiped out an entire family. Never in a million years could Trevor have imagined anything like this to be true. And yet he had heard it from Gigi's own mouth. But Grandpa, Dad had pleaded with the old man back at the hotel. That wasn't your fault. You were just a kid. You couldn't have been expected to know what was going to happen. Gigi was adamant. I could have been expected to follow my training and to remember the things I'd been seeing ever since I'd set foot in Europe. I could have been expected to have half the brains God gave geese. But instead I was an idiot. A lot of innocent people paid the price for it, and I wasn't one of them. Tomorrow I'm going to tell them to save their medal for someone who deserves it. Trevor shook his head to clear it, but it did nothing to stop the whirling of his mind. Had they honestly traveled to Fort Benning, London, and all across France for Gigi to get a medal he wasn't even going to accept? Surely this hadn't been his great-grandfather's plan all along. It couldn't have been. Gigi had been having a fantastic time on the trip, at least at first. But the closer they'd gotten to Sainte-Régine, the more the weight of all this had started to press down on the old man. On the other hand, Dad said that the threatening messages from La Vérité had started even before they'd left Connecticut. Dad hadn't understood their full meaning, but Gigi should have. What a mess! The trip of a lifetime had turned into a disaster. Here they were, thousands of miles from home, for Gigi to get an honor he didn't deserve and no longer wanted. Hardest to accept was that the awful girl and boy who'd been dogging their movements had been right all along. Jacob Firestone was no hero, and nobody agreed with that more than Jacob Firestone himself. The thought of home made Trevor yearn to see Mom, and even his kid sisters, Kira and Kelsey. But when he pictured his bedroom, it struck another discordant note. The walls were covered with posters and pictures of World War II, and for some reason, they just didn't seem right anymore. Even though he'd been born decades after it had ended, the war had always been the center of Trevor's life. He was the great-grandson of a war hero, and even though he and Gigi were far apart in age, they'd always been best friends. He played video games based on the war, built models from it, read books and watched movies about it. He thought about it, dreamed about it, imagined what it must have been like to be there. In school, he never handed in a social studies project on any other subject. World War II was the largest single event in history, and a lot of people considered it humankind's greatest achievement, that so many whole countries could team up to fight against evil. Even now, Trevor felt that way with all his heart. But he had always pictured the war as a gigantic chess match, played by generals, using pieces that represented armies. Everything went like clockwork. You executed your strategy, conquered territory, defeated your enemies. He still believed World War II was right, yet now it seemed more like a wheel of fortune where the difference between life and death was pure luck. Whole cities could be sacrificed because they happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The bombs falling on you could be coming from your own planes as easily as those of your enemy. You could make it across the deadliest expanse of Omaha Beach, only to put your foot down on a mine as soon as you'd reached semi-safety. And perhaps worst of all was what happened to Gigi, where a tiny lapse of judgment resulted in the deaths of innocents. Your mistake, your fault. End of story. Chaos was the word Gigi had once used to describe war. It looked cool on a movie screen or in a video game. But when real lives were being lost, snuffed out by sheer random chance, there was no glory. There had been no glory 3/4 of a century ago in Sainte-Régine for Private Jacob Firestone, and Trevor could see that his great-grandfather would be haunted by it until the end of his life. He was pretty lost by then, but he knew he'd be able to find Otois Rouge. Sainte-Régine was so small and the cathedral towered over everything, like a beacon that would guide him to the hotel. Upset as he would have to go back eventually. It was a long way to Connecticut, and Dad had the tickets and passports. Trevor took one more corner and practically ran into her. The blonde girl was walking briskly in the opposite direction. They both froze for a moment, staring at each other. "Don't run away," Trevor told her. "I did not throw that stone." She stuck her chin out defiantly, expecting an accusation. "I believe you, but I also believe you know who did. Your friend with the motorcycle?" "My cousin Philippe," she admitted. "I am Juliette Lafleur. Perhaps you have heard this name?" "I've heard it," Trevor replied gravely. "From Gigi, from my great-grandfather, a man he once knew, René Lafleur." "My great-grandfather," she confirmed. "The only survivor." "Gigi also told me about La Vérité. That's you, right, and your cousin, the Hall of Fame pitcher?" "Excuse me?" "It takes a pretty big arm to heave a cobblestone that size through a window 3 stories up." "What do you want from us?" "Is this not obvious?" she asked emotionally. "We do not want your Gigi to be honored in our town. Why do you think we formed La Vérité and posted warnings? Why do you think we traveled to Normandy and followed you across France?" Trevor was amazed. "But how did you find us? France is a big place." Juliette offered a rueful smile. "How could we not? You Americans describe every move you make on your Instagram. We knew when your boat would arrive in Cherbourg, and each place you would visit thereafter. You have a fine eye for detail, but you make a poor secret agent." "All to get revenge on a 93-year-old man," Jacob concluded resentfully. "No, not revenge. We wanted to persuade him to stay in America. And when he arrived in Cherbourg, we wanted him to change his mind and go home. After what he did to our family, he does not deserve to be honored." She let out a heavy sigh. "But now that you are here, we merely wish the ceremony to be over and you to be gone." Trevor nodded. "I get that. You'd probably be surprised to hear that Gigi doesn't think he deserves to be honored either." She flushed with anger. "Then why are you here? Did we not make it clear enough that the hero of Sainte-Régine was not wanted? When we vandalized your car and your hotel rooms, did you think we were the welcoming committee?" Trevor shrugged unhappily. "I can't figure out why he wanted to come. I don't know what to think anymore. Maybe he felt that by coming here he could somehow make amends for what happened. I'll tell you one thing, though. That quiet, weak, unhappy old man is not the great-grandfather I grew up with. Gigi is strong and lively and funny and loud. There isn't anything he doesn't have an opinion about. He's my favorite person in the entire world, or at least he used to be. But the closer we got to here, the more his guilt came crashing down on him. And if it's Sainte-Régine that's turning him into a shadow of himself, then I want him out of here twice as much as you do." He waited for an angry retort. It didn't come. Instead, Juliette said, "So we have something in common, you and I. We want this to be over. Et Lafleur and a file stone in agreement. Who would believe it? Maybe we want the same thing, Trevor pointed out. But can you say that for everybody else? That ceremony tomorrow is right out in the open. I have to know that Gigi will be safe. How many members of La Vérité are there? Juliet's reply was bitter. You continue to miss the point. We are not many, we Les Fleurs, thanks to your Gigi. The many aunts, uncles, and cousins we would have today, never born. So you need not feel the armies of La Vérité. There are but two of us, me and... She stopped short. Cousin Philippe. Trevor finished. Her expression was suddenly distressed, and she spoke in an anxious voice. Philippe is not a bad person, but he will not put the past behind him as I have decided to do. I begged him not to throw that stone. He would not listen. Do you think he'll try to bust up the ceremony tomorrow? Trevor asked anxiously. I feel so. He is very angry. We have to call the police, Trevor urged. No. Her tone was strident. He is what you Americans call a hot-head. But I will not have Philippe arrested over what he might do. That's easy for you to say, Trevor shot back. I know you love your cousin, but think how much damage one of those cobblestones could do to somebody's head, especially an old man. That wouldn't be good for Philippe either. He'd get sent to Devil's Island. Juliet laughed in his face. You see too many movies. Nobody gets sent to Devil's Island anymore. And in case you are wondering, we no longer have the guillotine. Okay, you don't like Gigi, Trevor concluded. And maybe he did an awful thing. But remember this. He was only here because he came from thousands of miles away to fight for France. Nobody made him. He volunteered. So he's a hero for that anyway. Him and Beau and Leland and Freddie. She looked shocked, and he realized that 2 tears had spilled over and were trickling down his cheeks. He had so much more to say, about how the young soldiers had risked their lives every day and how Freddie and Leland had made the ultimate sacrifice. But he didn't want to blubber all over her. So he finished with, You know how old Gigi was when he fought here? 17. Philippe is 17, she whispered. They stood there facing each other for what seemed like a long time. Trevor was breathing hard from the effort to keep his emotions in check. Juliet was lost in thought. Finally, she spoke up. I'm sorry, Trevor. I cannot inform the police. But who's going to protect Gigi if something bad happens? We will. You and I. Chapter 29. Saint-Drégier.